Hello, my name is Jason Debney and I am the CEO of the Thames Landscape Strategy, Weybridge, Hampton to Kew. Today I'm going to talk to you about an initiative by the Environment Agency called the West London Communities Project. I'm going to discuss what that scheme is, and then I'm going to talk about how the Thames Landscape Strategy is responding to it and what measures we're going to put in place through the refresh of the Thames Landscape Strategy and the Rewilding Arcadia project. Communities from Richmond up to Sunbury face the growing threat of flooding from multiple sources, which will continue to rise with climate change. Sea level rise and more extreme rainfall patterns will progressively increase flood levels in these places, impacting up to 4,000 residential and commercial properties in the TLS area. There is no longer time to sit back and pretend that nothing is happening. To manage increase in flood risk, the Environment Agency has developed a series of flood risk management plans for the Thames. In the Thames Landscape Strategy region, this includes the River Thames scheme for the freshwater river and the Thames Estuary 2100 plan for the tidal section. These plans are supported by a whole series of other strategic documents, such as the GLA London plan and their climate resilience strategy. At a more local level are the Lead Local Flood Authority plans to manage flooding at a borough level. The River Thames scheme sets out measures to manage flooding through the installation of a series of new flood relief channels and the modification of weirs between Weybridge and Teddington. It is important to note, however, that it also suggests that flood risk will increase in our patch, as there is very little that can be done locally to stop the water. This is where wider initiatives to manage flood water are important. What happens upstream and downstream is significant. Natural flood management measures in the headwaters of the Thames can slow water from entering the river in the first place. Setting back flood defences in the outer estuary can take a little off the top of a high spring tide before it moves up the river. On the tidal Thames, the TE2100 plan sets out an adaptive framework to manage flood risk. This includes a series of measures from defence raising to the installation of a new Thames barrier. I'm not going to talk in details about these schemes though. This talk is focused on a particular aspect of the suite of flood risk management plans that the Environment Agency is developing. This is set out in a project called the West London Communities Project that focuses on the unique flood risk associated with the Thames Landscape Strategy's stretch of the river. We call this particular flood event the freshwater tidal flood. It occurs when there is a high flow of water moving downstream during a freshwater flood. This water makes its way from Weybridge, past Sunbury, Wolsey and Kingston before entering the estuary at Teddington. What happens, however, if this high volume of water coincides with a spring tide moving up the tidal Thames and the sea? When this occurs, the water moving downstream hits the wall of water moving upstream. When this happens, the water can no longer make its way down the estuary. Instead, the water rises up and goes outwards, inundating the floodplain. Closing the Thames barrier is one of the ways that the Environment Agency currently manages this particular flood risk. By shutting out the incoming tide, the closure of the barrier helps to increase capacity in the Thames and its tributaries, reducing the impact of river flooding between Richmond and Sunbury by creating space for fresh water moving downstream to go. Climate change is bringing more extreme weather, flooding and frequent intense storm surges from the North Sea. This will increase the number of times the barrier needs to close to protect central London, putting significant pressure on its operation. So, from 2035, the Environment Agency will need to adapt how they use the Thames barrier in order to help protect the capital from these growing risks. Like all infrastructure, the Thames barrier requires regular inspection and maintenance to ensure it is reliable and can close when needed. Frequent barrier closures limit the time available for maintenance, which may reduce its reliability. Closures can also disrupt navigation and reduce upstream water quality. The TE2100 plan sets a threshold of 50 closures per year on average for the Thames barrier. The modification in the use of the Thames barrier by 2035 by limiting the number of times it closes means that the Environment Agency can continue to protect London up to 2070. What it does mean, though, is that it can no longer be used to manage the freshwater tidal flood events as it does at the moment. This change in its operation will have a significant impact on the Thames landscape between Sunbury and Richmond. Changing the use of the Thames barrier in 2035 is an action in the Thames Estuary 2100 plan. The plan pioneers an adaptive management approach to address the challenges of rising sea levels on the Thames Estuary and the growing threat of tidal flooding. It is important to note that the Environment Agency will continue to close the barrier for big fluvial events if they combine with high tides, with the potential to overtop walls and embankments in London. This is in line with the TE2100 plan approach to continue using the Thames barrier to manage flooding in defended areas between Teddington and Charlton. The flood defences, therefore, will continue to provide protection to their landward side. The change in the operation of the Thames barrier, however, will have an impact on the active floodplain. What is wet now is likely to get a lot wetter. So, is the 2035 deadline to change the Thames barrier operation a hard deadline? Yes, it is. The Environment Agency have made this decision using the best available evidence and data for the sea level rise and tidal variations, and the latest Thames barrier operating modelling. That gives us just 10 years to plan for the future. So how will flood risk change in our area when the operation of the Thames barrier is modified in 2035? Well, the simple answer is that the extent of a freshwater tidal event will be greater, both in the area of land that is inundated and in the depth of that inundation. You must remember that properties on the landward side of the existing network of flood defences will continue to be protected from a tidal flood event by the Thames barrier. TE2100 will set out how high these need to be raised in the future. More about that later. So properties behind the defences will continue to be protected, but post-2035, the way that floodwater inundates the active floodplain in between these defences will change along the tidal Thames. For much of the Thames, this doesn't matter, as the flood defences run almost directly alongside the main river channel. Upstream of Kew, though, the defences are set back from the riverbank, in places hundreds of metres away. This means that large areas of land will be at greater risk. This has not been a significant problem in the past, but due to climate change, the river is reclaiming its floodplain back. Upstream of Teddington Lock, where there are few flood defences, it is also the inundation of the floodplain that will be affected post-2035. This includes many assets such as homes and roads. The West London Communities Project team has summarised the impact that the change in the operation of the Thames barrier in 2035 will have, and it has published these on the TE2100 pages of the Environment Agency website. I would recommend all of you visiting this site to find out more. Details of how to do this are at the end of this talk. I'm not going to go into any great detail about the project, as there is simply not enough time. Rather, I'm going to demonstrate the type of information that is being shared and then explain how this will affect the work of the Thames Landscape Strategy. We have established already that the most severe flooding will occur from combinations of flooding such as high river levels coinciding with periods of intense rainfall and high tide. West London Community Project has produced a series of line graphs showing the change in water levels during these different types of flood events. This shows just how much higher water levels are expected to be at different locations during a freshwater flood coinciding with a particularly high tide. It is important to note that the models show the peak water level for that event, i.e. the peak of the high tide coinciding with the maximum river level in a flood. Therefore, the variation in water levels between low and high tides and different stages in fluvial flood represented in the model results. You're looking at a graph for the 1 in 20 year flood event, and you can see how much higher water levels are expected to be following the 2035 change. And in this side, you can see the 1 in 2 year flood event. You'll see that there is little impact in increased flood risk due to the change in the operation of the barrier upstream around Sunbury Lock. The real impact is felt downstream of Molesey towards the estuary. The impact looks frightening at Hammersmith, but it has to be remembered that the flood defences on the tideway will continue to provide protection against flooding, and will need to be raised where necessary to keep providing that protection. It is the area between Richmond Lock and Molesey, though, that this graph shows where the biggest and most significant changes in water levels are going to be. The same information can be shown in another way through the use of bar charts, depicting how water levels could change at different locations over time during different flood events. This graph shows Richmond Lock. What you can see is the leap in the height of the water level during all different flood scenarios. The graph also shows that the biggest impact will be in 2035, when the barrier operation is modified. As the century moves on, water levels increase, but not at the same rate as they do in 2035. These water level heights are for the centre of the river channel itself. When the water spreads out across the floodplain during a flood, it will inevitably decrease in height as it has more space to fill. The Thames Landscape Strategy is currently working with the Environment Agency to establish future water levels across the floodplain in key sites. At this stage of the talk, I also want to reassure you that the flood modelling I am talking about here is based on a combination of both river levels and tide levels. These use the same model as the River Thames scheme, with additional scenarios added to show the impact of the change in the operation of the Thames barrier. This ensures alignment between the modelling for the River Thames scheme and that for Thames Estuary 2100. These models also take into account what is happening way upstream in the headwaters of the Thames and down in Kent and Essex. We've established already that the most severe flooding will occur from combinations of high river levels coinciding with periods of intense rainfall and high tides. The graph for Ilpie Island shows that in these scenarios, water levels will increase significantly post-2035. In all of the different flood events, water levels will be above those of the 2014 flood, triggering a flood warning. Again, the big leap in changes to water levels are in 2035. Here is the graph for Kingston Bridge. Just as in the tidal reaches, the big jump in water levels takes place in 2035. Flood levels that were previously below the threshold to trigger a flood alert would automatically trigger a flood warning being above the 2014 flood level. What is wet now is going to get a lot wetter, and we have only 10 years to plan for these changes. The West London Communities Project has established what the risk to property and riverside infrastructure will be. Island communities are particularly affected. For example, for a flood of similar size to the 2014 event, an extra 276 properties will be inundated than would be at present. If you're concerned, the Environment Agency website has all the details that you need. The West London Communities Project has established a project timeline to prepare for the 2035 change in the operation of the Thames barrier. Over the coming decade, the Environment Agency will be working with communities and boroughs to establish a way forward to manage flood risk. 2 properties. So what will the Thames Landscape Strategy involvement be? Well, the West London Communities Project is all about properties. It is not about the active floodplain. The West London Communities Project will focus specifically on flood resilience measures for properties and critical infrastructure such as transport, hospitals and schools. The project itself would not look at flood resilience for public spaces, the Thames Path or moorings that are all located within the undefended floodplain on the river ward side of the flood defences. These locations will see increase in flood depths and extents because they are part of the floodplain and will play an important role as a buffer to the impacts of climate change. However, the West London Community Project will share the modelling data with the Thames Landscape Partnership for these active floodplains, and it will help us understand how to use it to inform the refresh of the Thames Landscape Strategy as part of the Joint Thames Strategy scheme. In this way, Thames Landscape Strategy can use flood models to inform how the active floodplain should evolve to account for increase in risk. That is the role that the Thames Landscape Strategy will have. It is our USP, if you like, building resilience to the undefended active floodplain. And that is what I'm going to talk about next. But before I do, just want to say a little more about the increasing risk to certain riverside communities within the TLS area. Many of these places have had an active involvement with the Thames Landscape Strategy over the past 30 years, supporting our work. To help communities adapt to climate change, while accepting that some flooding is unavoidable, the West London Communities Project will be looking at small-scale local measures to improve resilience to flooding for properties. These include installing property flood resilience measures, enhancing forecasting and warning systems to improve preparedness, raising property thresholds, or even raising entire buildings, newer raised defences such as walls and embankments, the construction of bunds around individual properties or groups of homes. The Thames Landscape Strategy will do everything that it can to support this, and will be updating the 1994 Thames Landscape Strategy report accordingly. Whilst TE2100 plan is considering possible options for flood storage areas downstream of the Thames barrier, there are no plans to create additional storage in the South West London or Surrey area. So, on to what the Thames Landscape Strategy will be doing in light of the changes in the operation of the Thames barrier in 2035. This will be through different projects of ours: Rewilding Arcadia and the Joint Thames Strategy Refresh. The update of the strategy will look towards creating riverside strategies to establish how multiple benefits in defence raising can be achieved. Whilst Rewilding Arcadia will look at building floodplain resilience through the introduction of nature-based solutions to work with water, whilst conserving what we cherish about the landscape. Firstly, I'm going to explain briefly what the Joint Thames Strategy is and how the refresh of the Thames Landscape Strategy fits into this. To do this, though, I have to refer back to those flood risk management plans that I talked about earlier. In the Thames Estuary 2100 plan, the Environment Agency calls for a new approach when upgrading flood defences. In the past, tidal flood defences were simply raised ever upwards as the risk from flooding increased. Now, TE2100 looks for defence-raising upgrades that also achieve a whole series of other multiple benefits. These include access to the river, maintaining views, better spaces for wildlife, and better design that sits more comfortably within its landscape setting. To achieve this, the Environment Agency has proposed a brand new process. This is called the Riverside Strategy Approach. A riverside strategy is a vision for a particular stretch of river. They should be part of the local planning system, and every riparian borough should have one by 2030. The riverside strategies should have set out what defence raising is needed and how multiple benefits can be achieved. The Environment Agency has indicated that one method to create riverside strategies is through the Joint Thames Strategy that will be written by the Thames Strategy Partnership to be published in 2027. The Thames Strategy Partnership is a collaboration between the Thames Landscape Strategy Partnership, the Thames Strategy Queue to Chelsea and the Thames Estuary Partnership. It is funded through the Regional Flood and Coastal Committee. Through this collaboration, 4 sub-regional strategies for the Thames will be created or updated, including the Thames Landscape Strategy. On one side of the Joint Thames Strategy are the 4 detailed Thames strategies that provide local guidance to inform decision-making. The 4 Thames strategies are the existing Thames Landscape Strategy Weybridge to Kew, the Thames Strategy Queue to Chelsea, and the Thames Strategy East. A new vision for the Thames Strategy Central London will be created, and a 5th strategy, the Thames Strategy Kent and Essex, would be desirable. However, this is going to have to be subject to a future funding bid, as it sits outside the Regional Flood and Coastal Committee funding at the moment. Owned and managed by their respective partnerships, each individual strategy aims to update their respective visions, to establish aspirations, setting out local objectives, priorities and benefits. The aspirations, if you like, that would inform a riverside strategy. These will be based on a detailed understanding of the local character and future flood risk, based on each of the individual strategies' landscape character assessments. This will sit beside community, borough and other stakeholder priorities. In this way, the individual Thames strategies will inform the building blocks to achieve the riverside strategy approach. On the other side of the joint is the Joint Thames Strategy itself. This will be a shared toolkit between all the individual, more locally based strategies, providing the information that underpins and aligns the local strategies. Together, the Individual Thames strategies and the joint Thames strategy will deliver a handbook for change to link future flood risk resilience across the River Thames in the context of increasing flood risk, with multiple benefits from Surrey right the way through to the sea. By bringing communities along in the process, the 4 Thames strategies will provide a day-to-day link between the river landscape, strategy partners, boroughs and the community. And in this way, boroughs can use the joint Thames strategy to inform their riverside strategy approach. The first thing we're doing to refresh the Thames landscape strategy is to update the generic and reach-specific landscape character assessments that were last refreshed way back in 2012 and originally written by Kim Wilkie in 1994. We are looking at what has changed and what else would be needed to inform a riverside strategy. The biggest gap in the TLS is that we have identified is that it contains little to no detail about what the current flood defences are, where they are located, and what their landscape character is set within their immediate landscape setting. The same need has been identified for the functional floodplain. Without this information, it is impossible to create the vision and propose the aspirations that the riverside strategy approach is calling for. To explain, take this hump in the road. The hump is actually the flood defence. The refresh strategy will have established what the character of that hump is, and how does that character sit within the wider character of the place. Alongside this will be technical data, including the current height of the defence and what increase in height would be needed by 2050 and 2090 based on the current climate change models. In this way, the strategy can then propose a whole series of measures that could be taken forward to achieve the multiple benefits when the defence is eventually raised, including guidance on how landscape character can be conserved and enhanced. This approach not only moves the delivery of TE2100 forward, but will also ensure that the defences are raised, so that the protection is given to infrastructure on the landward side of the defence. This is crucial, particularly when the predicted increase in water levels start to kick in following the 2035 change in the operation of the Thames barrier. The same process is being undertaken for the active floodplain. This is the most urgent part of the refresh, in my view, that we need to complete, as there are only 10 years to build climate and future flood-resilient floodplains. Through the creation of the riverside strategies, aspects including emergency planning, moorings, access to trip boats, and riverside businesses can all be weaved into the guidance. At the end of all this, we hope to have a Thames Landscape Strategy riverside strategy. Aspirations for the evolution of the landscape that could secure multiple benefits whilst ensuring future flood resilience, achieved through a process that will ensure local communities and other stakeholders understand and feel part of the process of change. So, that is how we intend to weave the TLS's objectives and vision into strategic policy. But also to be weaved into the refresh are the aspirations set out in one of the TLS's most exciting projects, known as Rewilding Arcadia. This scheme is looking at building future floodplain resilience through a series of geographically based projects. Rewilding Arcadia looks at recreating and restoring the lost floodplain to build future flood-proof spaces that can function during normal times in flood conditions and, importantly, in drought. If we don't plan for the changes that the West London Community Project is predicting, then by 2035, many of the riverside open spaces that we cherish so much will already have started to degrade. We can take our inspiration from Sime Flood Meadows, a TLSI, and the only natural riverbank left in London. This shows what a future flood-resilient landscape could look like. But importantly, we want to create places that are not just for wildlife, but also for people. Rewilding Arcadia follows TE2100's guidance by building floodplain resilience in a way that works with the natural rhythms and dynamism of the river, rather than fighting against it or through the construction of walls and defences. One way to protect riversides would indeed be through the construction of a wall, but the images on the left show just how high this wall would need to be. I hope that you will all agree that this would destroy the riverside's character, and has quite rightly been rejected. We must also remember that the West London Community Project is not proposing the creation of large areas of flood storage such as the measures that were proposed at Thames several years ago. The science simply does not back this up at the moment. We know that we are going to have to live with water in the future, and we have to plan accordingly in a more natural way. This is going to involve rethinking our floodplains as wet places rather than dry spaces. Places that traditionally flooded in the past have for the past 50 years been modified and managed as dry environments. The river wants its floodplain back, however, and we are going to have to put back new management practices that are appropriate to a wet floodplain once again. We know that this will be a hard pill to swallow, but time is already running out. It also means that some accepted habitats may need to evolve to create these wetter places. Here at Petersham Meadows, for example, the riverside wall by 2035 will be overtopped regularly and would no longer be a sustainable feature unless we want a field of mud behind it. The meadow will need to be rethought, a wet meadow that would still have cattle on it, but one that is designed to function during tidal inundation. And as we are creating places for water, for people, and for wildlife, dry routes would need to be considered. These projects will be both on the tidal and freshwater Thames, and will be informed by the science, the data that the West London Communities Project has published. From the Environment Agency flood risk models, we can use the science to inform where new structures such as boardwalks, ponds, reed beds, and wet woodland should go. This process can be carried out incrementally, small steps to deliver the desired outcome. In this way, landscape character can be conserved whilst we prepare the landscape for the future. This is not a new project for the TLS. We actually launched it way back in 2009, when we first started becoming aware of the impending 2035 modification of the use of the Thames barrier. During this time, we have been trialling different methods to build resilience, such as dry routes at Petersham and the restoration of the Hampton Court Palace water meadows. We have also been monitoring the river to see how wildlife is adapting to changing conditions. In 2001, we received a grant to start to develop these ideas. We carried out much consultation and further research through small-scale practical projects, slowly spreading the word that things are going to get a lot wetter and that the landscape is going to have to evolve. But don't just take my word for it. Here is our patron, Sir David Attenborough, just to summarise the project.
Climate change, however, has started to alter the delicate balance that sustains this remarkable place.
If we don't act now and start planning for the changes that we know are coming, much of what we cherish today could be lost as flood risk increases throughout the coming century. Rather than constructing large new flood defences to fight the forces of nature, a different approach has been proposed by the Thames Landscape Strategy called Rewilding Arcadia. The scheme offers a new way to live with water, one that reconnects people and wildlife with the lost floodplain of the river itself.
The first large-scale habitat restoration we would like to carry out will be on the lower sections of the old deer park in Richmond. This landscape is already wet and is linked to a series of wild spaces that extend downstream through the periphery of the Royal Mid-Surrey Golf Club towards Kew Gardens. The flood defence is set a couple of 100 metres back from the riverbank, and water enters through culverts, through the groundwater and over the top of low-lying embankments. It really is an area at risk from increasing flood risk, and this is an area that is already starting to change. Restoration of the natural floodplain could see a series of interconnected wetlands created that function at all states of the tide. Dry routes could be created through boardwalk installation, and important species such as the Thames door snail conserved. Protected views could be opened up to form a remarkable wetland on the doorstep of Richmond town centre. Identified sites up and down the river for projects. These range from small-scale initiatives to create future flood-resilient parks, such as at Kew Gardens, Cholmondeley Walk and Petersham, riverbank naturalisation at Canby Gardens in Kingston, and floodplain resilience measures in Molesey and Isleworth. The aspirations will be set out in the refreshed Thames landscape strategy and be prioritised to find a sustainable solution to known problems that the West London Communities Project models show are just going to get worse. The aspirations will follow the Riverside strategy approach by proposing many multiple benefits for people, for wildlife and for water. There need to be spaces that people can understand and access, for example. But at the same time, they also must have additional functions, such as being able to store carbon and to filter road runoff pollution. Did you know, for example, that a reed bed actually stores more carbon than a forest? Funding and long-term future management has to also be considered. The TLS, the Thames Landscape Strategy, has long promoted the idea for a floating herd to manage the wetlands, cattle moving from place to place, just as it is still carried out in the freshwater tidal habitats of the Netherlands. And this is exciting. The potential to restore lost freshwater tidal habitat can only take place at the top of an estuary and at the bottom of a freshwater river. And due to our riverside open spaces, we have the potential to recreate this internationally important habitat to benefit both aquatic wildlife and those animals that live in the intertidal areas. Local people will be at the heart of all our aspirations. In all TLS projects, it is local residents who help to develop the proposals, the strategy itself, and who volunteer to help implement and manage restoration work. The TLS will ensure that the spirit of the Thames Landscape Strategy is delivered and that communities are involved. To conclude, climate change has started to alter the River Thames in the TLS area. Several Environment Agency plans set out what high-level measures would be needed to manage this increase in flood risk. The first of these measures is set out in the West London Communities Project that will see a modification in the way that the Thames barrier is used, and this will have implications to the Arcadian Thames and its floodplain. Rather than just sitting back, though, as if nothing is happening, we are looking to this future to start planning how we can build a future flood-resilient floodplain. These ideas will be set out in a Riverside strategy, in a refreshed Thames landscape strategy, and taken forward through a series of locally based initiatives under the Rewilding Arcadia project. Before we finish, though, and I move on to the last slide, which has the web links on, please do listen to Sir David Attenborough again, as he sums up what I've talked about.
Climate change, however, is starting to alter the River Thames. Every day we stand by and do nothing is a day wasted.
We must use the opportunity offered by Rewilding Arcadia to create an environment that is in harmony with nature rather than fighting it.
If we don't act now, it'll be too late.
Our motivation should be hope, not fear of change. We can conserve and enhance the unique heritage, wildlife and recreational opportunities that this most special stretch of the river offers. I have watched the Thames Landscape Strategy grow and flourish. I've seen how they have transformed the landscape. I now look forward to their next phase as they update the 1994 Kim Wilkie strategy to incorporate the groundbreaking aspirations of Rewilding Arcadia. What is proposed is remarkable, considering that this floodplain sits within the largest urban area in the United Kingdom. It offers a real opportunity to restore the lost floodplain, to reconnect people with the natural world, whilst delivering so many other benefits at the same time. By acting now, we can plan for the changes that will be needed whilst conserving the character of the Arcadian Thames that we all cherish.